Hello, everybody. Thanks for tuning back into Speakeasy. May I say you're looking lovely this afternoon or evening, whichever the case may be. This edition of Speakeasy, we are really going to earn our name by talking about organized crime in New York in the 1920s. Now, this is a really fascinating subject, and it is much more interesting and complex than I can really do justice to in this short amount of time. I'm going to summarize in broad strokes the general tone, the tenor of crime in 1920s New York, especially organized crime, but I would absolutely encourage you, if you have the desire, to go out and do a little research on your own. So let's talk about it. The 1920s wasn't a particularly stable time for anyone, not even organized crime, and definitely not organized crime in New York City, which was one of the loudest, most crowded, most exciting modern cities in the world at the time. People from all over the world were flowing into New York, and their experiences, their expectations, and the alliances that they would form with other people would really color the character of the city. Now, obviously, as with any city of considerable size, there were any number of independently operating psychopaths, poisoners, murderers, and the like operating in New York City, and some of their stories are very interesting. However, seeing as we're talking about organized crime this time, and seeing as how in the 1920s, especially in a big city like New York, ethnic identity was very characteristic. A person could be much more defined by their ethnic identity. There were very strong ethnic neighborhoods where people who all came from the same country would live together, and they would be very tightly defined. Ethnic identity is a major factor in the kind of gangs that were operating. The three that we're going to be talking about the most for the 1920s are Italian, Irish, and Jewish gangs. The stories of the Italian and Jewish mobs are very easy to talk about in sort of the same breath, so we'll discuss those as a unit in a second. But first, a word about Irish-American gangs during the 1920s. Irish-American organized crime had about 100 years head start on any of the other gangs we'll be talking about. There was a large influx of Irish immigration very early in New York's history. You may have seen some of the gangs portrayed in the film Gangs of New York. That was more or less true to life. The 5 Points Gang was active for a very long time, the Dead Rabbits, and there were just dozens and dozens of smaller Irish-American mobs that were very active in areas like extortion, prostitution, to a certain degree the narcotics trade, although not very much. The thing to understand is how much of an impact Prohibition had on organized crime. The problem that Irish-American gangs ran into is they had a large amount of relatively small-scale leaders without an overall organizing influence. This meant, although there were many, many Irish gangsters, and the Irish mob was of a fairly good size, it tended to be organized on a smaller level around, say, individual personalities, rather than around a sort of monolithic organization, and because of that it had a very hard time keeping pace with the better organized, more stratified Italian and Jewish gangs. There were some very interesting personalities during the 1920s in the Irish mobs. The big one was probably Big Bill Dwyer. He emerged in New York as a leading bootlegger. He was arrested, and then a lot of his associates split into different camps after that, and he never really reached that heights. But for a while, Big Bill Dwyer, born William Vincent Dwyer, was a leading member of the bootlegging community, if you want to call it that, in New York. What's interesting as far as this game goes is he was Irish, and he got his start working as a stevedore. Now, working as a stevedore is an absolutely excellent way to be involved in any kind of bootlegging or smuggling or any trade like that, because you have intimate access to a large number of ships and vessels, many of which have secret compartments that only you would know about. So it could be that, I think by this point in the game we've divined that there is a fair amount of funny business going on, as involves fencing and the selling of stolen goods, and possibly the attempted smuggling of the Dagger of Amon, things like that. If we want to turn a suspicious eye on Steve Dorian, the stevedore, who is in fact at the party for mysterious reasons tonight, ostensibly to see us, I suppose, he is in fact in a historically correct position to be a member of the Irish mob, and he is in a place where he could easily be smuggling things out. As I said, though, the Irish mob had sort of a hard time keeping pace with the other two major forces in organized crime at the time. The one being the Jewish Mafia. It is, in my opinion, hilariously called the Kosher Nostra, after the Cosa Nostra, or Our Thing, which is what the Italian mob was called, and as far as that goes, the Italian mob. Now, I said at the beginning of the video that the 1920s weren't a particularly stable time for anyone, including organized crime. At the very end of the 1920s, at the very end of 1929 and 1930, there will be this large conflict between New York Italian organized crime called the Castamarese War. And it is going to serve to organize Italian organized crime into a much more cohesive whole. It's called the Commission, and it's led by what are called the five families: the Lucchese, the Bonaro, the Gambino, the Genovese, and the Colombo families. This has not yet happened during the 1920s. And so, for all of the influx of Italian and also Jewish people to New York, which is what provided the impetus and a lot of the strength for the Italian and the Jewish mafias, there is still a lot of division. There is, especially within the Italian mafia, a real power struggle as to how things are going to be handled. The two main factions on this side are, I think, hilariously named. There is the Mustache Petes and the Young Turks. The Mustache Petes were traditionalists. They were called that because they had big, fancy mustaches. They dressed like people from the old country dressed, especially Sicily and Genoa. The Young Turks were a different faction. They were, it must be said, much more bloodthirsty than the Mustache Petes were. However, they were also a good deal less racist. Now, I'm not sure that's necessarily a point in their favor, because it certainly doesn't indicate any sort of tolerance or multiculturalism on their part. It's simply that they didn't have any compunction about working with anyone in order to get power. Now, this did make them a good deal more versatile and a good deal stronger. For instance, they had a large number of resources, which they found in the Jewish American Mafia, that the Mustache Petes simply did not have access to, or would not have access to, because they would not lower themselves to working with non-Italian Americans. So, as I said, these two factions were in a good bit of conflict during the 1920s. It would have been relatively unsure for, say, a member of the Jewish American Mafia, or for somebody, say, like Ziggy, who I don't necessarily think would have been strongly identified with Italian or Jewish American, or, for instance, Ernie Leach, who was African American. It would have been a relatively unsure position for them. They certainly could have worked for the mob in some senses. However, they would have had to have worked for someone who was a member of the Young Turks, and if the territory struggle led to the Mustache Petes taking power, they certainly would have been out of a job. Mustache Petes certainly would not work with probably Ziggy, and not with an African American. So, as I said, things were relatively unsure, insecure in that sense. That same sort of internal conflict did not plague the Jewish American Mafia at the time. They were also sort of finding their feet. Both the Italian and the Jewish Mafia were involved extensively in things like extortion, in breaking picket lines and fighting unions before the 1920s. However, they began to organize in a very extreme degree after Prohibition hit, and that's because it was something which was prosecuted fairly heavily by the United States federal government, although enforcement could be lax in some areas. But it was also extremely profitable and extremely accessible to the average citizen. Most people living in New York at the time didn't care much for Prohibition, and many people did not feel any compunction at all about breaking it to try to get their way into speakeasies. And that is where most of their money came from during this time. One interesting point of note is that Ernie mentions doing some fencing work for Big Al. It could probably be assumed that he's talking about Al Capone, who was a prominent mobster in Chicago in the 1920s. That would actually be historically correct, because Al Capone was one of the people who was very much backed by the Young Turks. He was not associated with the old guard, the Genoese families. And as I said earlier, these would have been the Young Turks would have been the ones who definitely would have consented to work with someone who would have, if they had a talent for fencing, regardless of their race, creed, or color, definitely would have worked with them, as opposed to the sort of stuffier old guards. It's worth mentioning that the Young Turks came out on top in the end, and so they would have been in some ways rising in power during the 1920s. It's also worth saying that at this point in time, it probably would not have been escalating to outright murders between factions quite yet. It would have been more struggling for dominance over different enterprises, whether extortion, gambling, prohibition, things like that. So if we're seeing some conflict between people at the museum, it is extremely possible that this could be a case of rival criminal interests competing for ownership and for dominance over what would be a very lucrative smuggling operation if they managed to smuggle out priceless Egyptian artifacts. I guess if I had to characterize the organized crime in the 1920s, especially in New York, I think I could do it best by listing a quote about one of the most prominent Jewish American mobsters at the time, who is Arnold Rothstein. They said he transformed organized crime from a thuggish activity by hoodlums into a big business run like a corporation. That is, in essence, very much what the 1920s was about. There was tremendous wealth available to those who would take it because of Prohibition. There was also a move away from what might be seen as more of the Irish mob way of doing things, which is control of neighborhoods, local control by small individual gangs, into more of a streamlined, organized organization with clearly defined roles for the different mobsters and a process of, or a chain of respect and authority and influence. This was the time when mobsters became really, truly very big business. Starting off in alcohol and bootlegging, as I said, and crime certainly did take a hit when Prohibition was repealed, but they were able to make that up in terms of selling narcotics and prostitution. They became very heavily involved in the bribery of policemen and officials. It would not be out of character to say that, for instance, Detective O'Reilly, if he talked about accepting bribes and things, he's probably talking about accepting them from organized criminals. Really, most of the cast in the Dagger of Amon-Ra could theoretically quite easily have some ties to organized crime. I mean, you've got O'Reilly, who is a corrupt policeman, which was just the absolute top thing that the organized crime organization would love to have. You've got Ziggy, who is, I would eat my hat if he wasn't involved in organized crime of some sort. Steve is certainly seeming to be in a prime position. Yvette is definitely out for something, and she knows and works with Ernie, who's confirmed as being a fence. So I think knowing a little bit about the milieu, the background of organized crime in New York in the 1920s might be very valuable and something to definitely keep in mind as we try to understand the events of the evening. I hope that has filled in a little bit of the history of 1920s crime in New York for you. Thanks for tuning in. Hopefully next update we will finally finish the chapter. We will ask the questions that you want to ask of the characters involved, and we will get one step closer to finally solving the mystery of the Dagger of Amon-Ra. See you next time.